G'day, welcome to the Financial Bloke Podcast, the podcast for people seeking the wisdom needed to grow their family's wealth and live a happier, healthier and more prosperous life. My name's Ben Law and I am the Financial Bloke. John Moor is our guest today and he's backed by popular demand. John's a highly experienced succession planning facilitator and his episode number 24 was one of our most popular so far. So if you haven't listened to it yet, go back and have a listen as the feedback has been amazing. John and I both have a strong drive to help you, our listeners, and we've decided to do another succession episode, drawing on our combined over 50 years experience helping rural producers. Due to the size of the topic, we've decided to split it into two episodes, addressing the younger generation, or what I'm calling the young'uns, and the older generation, or what we're affectionately calling the oldies. In this episode, we'll be focused on the young'uns, or the next generation coming through. Now, if you're in this age group and you're serious about getting ahead, it's important you get your parents to listen. And any parents listening, get your kids onto this ASAP. Now, without further delay, it's time to get cracking. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Ben. Good to be back again. It seems to be we catch up pretty regularly nowadays.
And I just want to start off with is we did episode number 24, John and I, which, to be frank, was one of our most popular podcasts. You know, in technical terms, I think it blew up the internet, seemed to be shared around a lot, and John managed to get a whole heap of phone calls, which was fantastic and help out a lot of people. And what we talked about in that episode was succession planning and why a facilitator is, or a succession facilitator, what they are and why they're so important. And today after that episode, we actually sat down and had a deconstruction or a debrief where we went through and said, well, why was this so popular? What were people looking for? And how can we help better? And what we came up with was 100 episodes we could do. And we thought, well, where do we start next to try and help more people out? And we figured the best path we thought we could go down is to talk directly to the listeners. So that's to you. And we wanted to talk to two separate demographics, shall I say, the mums and dads, or the older generation, and then the younger generation, the kids, in inverted commas. And so we're going to split that up into two episodes. And the first episode, which is today's, we're going to talk about the young'uns. And the next episode, we're going to talk about, in inverted commas and with affection, the oldies.
That's correct.
And so what I'd like to say is before we kick off is that if you are of the mum and dad generation or the older generation, you should be listening to this still. And if you're of the younger generation coming through, you should be getting your mum and dad to listen to this because it'll be applicable to both of the demographics. So where we'll start off, John, is what was the feedback you actually got from episode number 24, mate?
Ben, firstly, thanks for having me. It's really humbling, to be honest, how many phone calls I did receive on the back of that last podcast. And it varied, the feedback varied from proactive to desperate. I had phone calls from people who are literally at the end of their string, to people who were right in front of it and were proactive, wanting to get in front of the conversation, understood the urgency and the need to have these conversations. There's a lot of confusion, and there still is in succession planning, and it's I probably want to start right there, actually, is succession planning doesn't have to be, and in my opinion and experience, isn't a bad or difficult thing to go into. And it doesn't fail if it's done correctly. It fails when it's done incorrectly. So the message I'm asking your listeners to take home today is that just because someone else has failed at succession planning, whether you're the older or younger generations, it's simply because it hasn't been constructed and planned properly. It's just like planting your wheat crop or breeding your cattle. You do that properly with support and help and spend some money on it, and it's just part of the business, or the part of running a successful business. So, yeah, it's been all of the above. I've probably fielded over 100 phone calls. Some people are getting active and we've already met. Some people are delaying it till next year so we can meet then. And some people are probably going to not phone me back after the initial contact just because it's more comfortable not to do so. And that's normal because it takes time for these these type of thoughts to settle in bed, and then action comes from that.
And one of the episodes, I think, later on down the track, and if anyone listening thinks this would be a good idea, make sure you reach out, send me an email or something on the socials, is how to get the rest of the family engaged. I think that's a really important point, because quite often the conversations we had, John, is someone within the family would reach out and say, we need help, but it's them on their own. They know they need help. The rest of the family or someone else in the family potentially who has the most say is reluctant. It's quite often, and I have to be careful saying this, but it's the cantankerous old bull in the corner that doesn't want to go through the gate. So I think that'd be a great episode for us to do. So anyone that thinks that'd be good, give us a shout out. So and I think I just want to make the point, John, just before we move on, is that I think with succession, it's one of those things that I've seen over the years is there's a bit of tenacity required. You can't just plant a crop one year and then, that's it. You've got to replant every year. So I think succession's a process. It takes time. And also you just can't give up at the first, hurdle. Yeah. And the success usually comes from who, not how. It's not how do we do this, it's who do we get to help us do it. So
correct, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're speaking to the next generation or the young'uns. And I'm 45 now, John, so anyone under 45 is a young'un. Anyone under 30 is probably a very young'un to me now. So we're talking directly to you as listeners. Why do we need to talk to them now when they're not the ones that have got control of the reins?
Ben, I suppose it goes without saying they will eventually, or should eventually, get control over time. And if we are talking to the word of succession means exactly that. Succession is a process of change over time. It's not a one-off event. And if we're not talking to who I'm going to loosely categorize here as the 20 to 30-year-olds, they're not going to be in front of the game. They're going to suddenly find themselves 30 to 45-year-olds and in all sorts of trouble if they haven't started planning. So for today's conversation, we break it up into the early young'uns, 20 to 30-year-olds. It's probably their first job. They've seen the family business working with mum and dad in it, and they have either studied or gone away and done something, and they've come back. So it's probably their first job. It's their first employment. Just as most of ours, we didn't have that many expectations going into some of these things. We didn't have contracts. We didn't have pay initiatives and incentives. We just came back and we worked pretty hard. We trusted, and most of the young people I work with, they trust their parents pretty implicitly, whether that's by force or by design. But that's what I generally find is the younger generation come back, trust mum and dad. You're normally not married or have partners or kids at that stage. So there's not a hell of a lot to lose. What could go wrong? It's the first time you've got a paycheck. It's the first time you've got a farm ute. You've got T-bone steaks in the deep freeze from the latest kill. And it's pretty easy to slip into that mode and just start without any formal or formalized agreements. And that's the point where we should stop and say, that's not good enough, because we're running a multi-million-dollar business here, and we should have those structures set up from a very early phase. So that's typically the 20 to 30-year-old people, and it's girls and boys who coming back into the business.
So, John, just on that as well, it could be those that have been there on the farm for a hell of a long time. If you came out of school at 18 and came back onto the property and then you're 28, you could have been there for 10 years and you've just potentially fallen into just comfort. It's just the routine you follow. It's always been the same, and we're not too stressed about moving anything forward.
Yeah, you haven't got that many expectations at that point in time, and as I said, you've got a few dollars coming in every week, enough to buy beer and groceries and go play footy on the weekends.
But you've also time will change that very quickly. You go from 28 to 30 to 32 to 34. My experience is people's view of the world, or I know mine did, changes dramatically in those 2 to 4 years.
Yeah, and you've had lots of promises are getting made to you during that 5 to 10 year period. That one day something will change, or tomorrow things are going to change and we're going to involve you in the business, and your worldview definitely changes, absolutely definitely changes, and that's the feedback I'm getting from a lot of people. I know that because I work in the space, but they say, you know what, at 20 I thought it nothing could go wrong. At 28, all hell's breaking loose around me because what I started out doesn't look like it's going to end the way I thought. So that there is a huge shift in people's thinking.
Well, people want to make their mark, don't they? I mean, I've always looked at it this way. When you get between 28 and 32 is when you get a fire in your belly to actually achieve something. Up until then, you're just sort of doing what I call the apprenticeship phase. So I've always called it that 18 to 30 is your apprenticeship phase where you're learning. And then from 30 to 45 is the acceleration phase. That's when you've got enough experience under your belt to be useful. You've still got a massive fire in your belly. You've got enough energy. That's the acceleration phase. And so for me, I remember when I hit that, I came back from London at about 27, 28, and then I hit 30, and I was at the peak of my, that crossover where my energy and drive and experience where I was really valuable. So once you get past that, you start to get people start to get antsy about, look, when am I going to get when am I going to get off the bench and going to start to play some games?
Yeah, exactly. And at that stage as well, the parents are changing. They've now been in the game for 20 or 30 years. So they're starting to look at the other side of the bench, and they want you to slow down. You wanting to accelerate into this game, but you don't know what rules you're playing to. It's like playing footy with a tennis ball. You just don't know if you should pick it up and run with it or hit it. So that's what we're finding all the time. You've been there for these 3 to 10 years. You've got nothing on your balance sheet as a young individual, single or married by now. You've got nothing to show for your work. You've been paid something and you've been promised a hell of a lot, but you physically don't have much on your balance sheet. You've got a young family potentially and all sorts of needs or changing needs coming through as you get married or partner up and have kids. And suddenly your worldview changes from being one family with mum and dad to being my family with my own needs, desires, and suddenly that thing really needs direction and commitment. And unfortunately, the matriarchal family member of that new entity, if that's what you call them, sometimes won't stand up or very seldom stands up to the parents and demands or requires them to come up with solutions that fit their model. So it's very challenging. There's a lot of agitation takes place in that close to the 30-year-old range. But getting back to the 20s, the 20-year-olds to 30-year-olds, those are mostly the type of things that pop up. Is that there's lots of energy, not much expectation from either side, not much commitment or formalization of the employment contract. And you just get on with stuff, and then suddenly you wake up one day and you're 35 or 30, and you realize you should have had or desperately need things to change and change quickly.
And so that takes us directly into that next age bracket, which is the over 30s. Where do what it's sort of that, would you say 30 to early 40s usually, or mid 40s, John? Is that age bracket where as you get older you get more agitated, or there's usually more agitation within the family for change?
Today's episode is brought to you by AgriCoach. You've worked bloody hard over the years and you've built a solid operation. But as your children grow up and start their own journeys, you're beginning to think about the next 5, 10, and even 15 years and how to keep driving the business forward and ensure a smooth and successful succession plan. Preparing the business, preparing the next generation, and preparing for your eventual retirement all requires a solid plan and a proven process. Unsure about the right steps to take? Head on over to agricoach.com.au/webinar to learn more about our Succession Proof Your Family webinar. AgriCoach, aligning families, growing wealth, and protecting legacies. And now, let's get back to the episode.
Ben, can I just bring us back to one point in those 20 to 30-year-olds?
Absolutely, yeah.
Or just something you'd want to include there, is that often I get asked by them, how do I start as a 20-year-old? What would I be saying to these guys? And it's really take control of your future, because chances are if you don't take control, somebody else is going to take control for you. And that generally doesn't end well, because you lose the direction, you get the confusion.
So what do you mean by take control, John? Like if someone's sitting there going, oh, I'd like to take control, what's some sort of suggestions, or what do you mean by take control?
Benno, you've got to have a voice. You've actually got to stump up and have a voice in, and I'm not talking to everybody out there, obviously.
Of course, yeah.
But if this is you and you've been dominated or been marginalized in the process of the business and the evolution of the successional management of it, you need to have a voice. You need to call it what it is, pull up the process and insist or agitate to have a different conversation. You need to educate yourself, continuously educate yourself through the process. You need to negotiate your pay and your skill. They need to marry up. You've been there for a couple of years now, and I don't know what wage you're going to be on, but most wages I look at certainly don't reflect a market-related wage. And your mates are earning something in the six figures, and you're still earning in the $20,000 and $30,000 a year, and it suddenly doesn't stack up. So have expectations is the other one. Have expectations of yourself, your family, your parents, your business, and then initiate the conversation. As I said just now, if it's not been initiated by the older generation, I'd suggest at 20 or 30 years old, you actually initiate that conversation so that it starts before you get into the next age bracket of those 30 to 45-year-olds, because if you don't, the simple answer is you're going to be working on assumptions. You're going to be working on assumptions, and you're going to be guessing what the other people are thinking, and as we all know, assumptions end badly. And so just initiate that conversation. As difficult as it is, get started and draw a line in the sand. Tell the business and the family we need to start the conversation and get help.
Because I think that's a really important point, John, is if I could just make a couple of points here, is the number one is that some of the next generation falls into the category of it's mum and dad's responsibility to sort this out for me.
Correct.
Whereas I think they need to step up and go, okay, well, if it's not happening, how can I facilitate this? So how can I actually find a path to a solution here that suits everyone? Yep. And there's going to be a bit of old bull, young bull, or that's a little sounds sexist, but there's going to be a bit of that. You understand what I'm saying? There's going to be a bit of agitation there, but to be able to figure out an intelligent, business-minded way of a solution, and when family, it's awful hard. The second thing is from my point is, I remember when I was back early in my financial advice days, and I was working in a firm when, John, I was 24, 25, and I was told I'd be the succession plan for the business. So I was the younger generation coming through, and I was sold a lot of empty promises, shall I say. Yeah. And I look back now, not embarrassed, but I look back at the lessons and I go, well, the problem is I looked at it as how can they provide me a solution to come into the business, where I wasn't thinking about how can I add so much value to the situation that it's a no-brainer for them. So, look at the business that you're in, the family business, and go, okay, well, how can I add so much value to this family business that it's just a natural succession for me? Grab the bull by the horns, become really valuable, and then you don't have to agitate. It'll just naturally happen over time. Yeah,
I often say to these younger generations is find your niche in that business. It doesn't and shouldn't necessarily be what mum and dad are good at. It should be what you're good at, where your skill is and what you're passionate about. And you actually build that business rather than just do that business on the back of what mum and dad have. Because if you can't grow the business, I can tell you for sure there's no space for you later down the track. You have to grow that business from a $100,000 income business to a $500,000 income business, because the growth is what's going to keep both families in this thing. If it only ever remains a $100,000 business, then you've bought yourself a job. You haven't bought yourself a future. You've got a job, and you might as well go and work for someone who's going to pay you a full salary for that job. And I say this without reservation. If that's what you've bought yourself as a job in your family business, be careful, because that's all it's going to become, and it's only ever going to be big enough to sustain the one family who at this stage is probably going to be the older generation, and you're going to be a worker there in that business. And what I find happens every single time is the triangulation of conversations around this point, is that we don't talk to the problem or to the point. if the discomfort sits with me as the son, for instance, I normally go speak to my wife about it and moan and grumble to her. Very seldom does the son or the daughter speak directly to the founders, the owners, or the parents of the business. And that triangulation just breeds resentment. It breeds confusion. And if any advice I can give you is go to the source of the itch. Don't scratch it. Go to the people who you need to have the conversation with as early as you can, and just put it out there.
And I suppose small conversations from an early age is so much better than no conversations, and then 10 years later it exploding in a very uncomfortable conversation, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's much easier to try to sort the small stuff out as they develop.
Yep.
But we'll touch on that later. There's a whole heap of probably don'ts, do's and don'ts, and exactly that. I say don't let people live rent-free in your head. That means don't let the conversation in your head dominate what should be done, and you just build up this self-fulfilling prophecy and story that goes round and round in your head, but you never verbalize that to the people who should be part of the solution. So if you find yourself talking about somebody else in your head, that's the person you should be talking to verbally.
That's a good point. So we've talked about the 20 to 30-year-olds, John. We move on now to the 30 plus.
I think so, because they are different. They are a different animal, and they've got different needs.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that, again, anyone listening in that 20 to 30 bracket, this is actually far more important for you, this information, because if you don't do what you need to do when you're in your 20s, you're going to be dealing with the problems that the 30 plus are dealing with right now.
Exactly, yeah, because what we'll talk about now is going to give the 20 to 30-year-olds a snapshot of the drama and pain they can face if they don't address it today. If they wait until they become these 30 to 55-year-olds sometimes, with a 92-year-old father who's still running the show, this is a little peek view into possibly what that might look like. And if you don't like what we're going to discuss now, and you're in the 20 to 30-year bracket, take action.
Righto. So, what's the position that age group is in, John?
Ben, they've definitely been in the business now for anything from 15 to 20 years. So they have been in this family business, let's assume, because there's a succession conversation that hasn't been had, or it's been had but hasn't been finalized. The business itself could be looking for a successor. So the older generation could be sitting there guessing or assuming that either John or Ben, who's been there for 20 years, is the successor, and maybe Ben or John doesn't necessarily believe that they are the successor. They might be wanting to do something different, and they're stuck in this position. So it's a wide demographic of people who find themselves there, either by default or by design. But very often the design they find themselves in, or the default they find themselves in, hasn't been planned, hasn't been executed, and hasn't been thought through while they were in their 20s and 30s. And the problem at this stage is you've got limited choices. When you're 20 and 30, you had a huge amount of choice. You had options. When you're 55 or 45 and you've got a family with 3 kids in their teens now, suddenly you find that you are up against a wall, probably with nowhere to turn.
An empty balance sheet as well means that there's nothing in the coffers to be able to make choice.
Exactly. Yep. They've been potentially promised something, or not even promised something, but generally promised that all this work you've put in will eventuate into some fantastic assets transfer at some point in time. Mum and dad think that the 3 or 4 sibling brothers and sisters you have off the farm will be very happy that the farm just carries on generationally, because that's where you all have fun on the weekends. And the poor family or families who stuck on the farm making a go of it believe it'll be all theirs one day because they've worked there for 30 years. But when you come to the end game, which is inheritance, everyone has a design and a desire to be cut in on the value of these properties generally. And the guys who've been there for that time just have those choices taken away from them.
And it's interesting, John, as I mentioned before, you've got a as I said, the 20s is the apprenticeship phase. The 30s is the acceleration phase. I call the 40s the pivot phase.
Yeah.
And the pivot is you've succession planned the farming business and you've changed the way you're doing things and you accelerate ahead again, or you go into decline, or you end up in family breakdown and the business just keeps shrinking.
Yeah.
And you see that from time and time again. If is that pivot phase becomes really, really important to have a plan in place for then.
Yeah, and interestingly, with all the families I work with, in that 30 to 40 year gap, the choice actually gets taken away from you, or the options. They actually revert back to your parents, because at that point in time, the older generation's needs are suddenly ramping as well. They're looking over the hill and they're seeing something that looks like retirement or older age coming into view. And suddenly they realize that they possibly haven't stashed something away for that. And you looking at the other side of the hill with a vertical cliff in front of you, in that phase where you wanting to go, and you just can't, because we haven't sorted out the older generation's needs. So, yeah, you get stuck between this rock and a hard place. The older you get, the less choice. The older you get, the more reliant you become on the older generation to actually supply the solutions, because at that point your options are really stay in under the current circumstances, which are not necessarily great, or eject. And eject at that age doesn't look pretty, because you don't have the money in the bank, you don't have the additional skill, you've got children, you've got a whole family unit you're trying to now move from something that's become very much yours in your view, and it's also very much theirs in the parents' view, and there's this disconnect.
And I think if families have, and I could be wrong, John, so I'd love your feedback on this. My sense is that if you have a family dust up in your 20s over this, so if you've got a young lady's come back, or a young man's come back to the farm or is on the farm, and you have a family dust up in your 20s, you can get over that. Like, it seems to be that, there's going to be some youthful indiscretions probably, not as much wisdom and experience on young shoulders, and we can get over it. But when you have family dust-ups in the 40s, families really struggle to come back from that, don't they? It just seems to be, and the older generation gets, the harder it is for them to be adaptive to the change. It seems to be like, when you come across people who are 75, 80, it's very hard for them to make decisions about the best way to go forward.
100% correct, Ben. And if only the 20 and 30-year-olds took heed of that and made those hard calls when they were that age, ejecting at 25 or 30, if it was you or I, we could have started again. We could have come back to the business at a later stage when we had more maturity or clearer direction or more skill, whatever it is that's caused the early dust up. We can always come back, because mum and dad are at their peak at that point in time. They're in their 40s and early 50s. We're still in our 20s and 30s. So no one's really lost much there except some time. And 100% correct that if have the bust up early, if it's going to go that way, you haven't got expectations, you haven't got broken promises, you've just got maybe a bit of a bruised ego, and you either run away with your tail between your legs and come back and admit the mistakes that might have been made, or you continue with a totally different career path.
And I think dust-ups can even just be uncomfortable discussions, John. It doesn't necessarily have to mean the family busts up. It's just that we have the uncomfortable discussion. And It's interesting. I just want to give a prime example. I remember I helped a family out about 8 or 9 years ago, and it was an only son, no daughters. It was an only child, a son in his 40s. Mum and dad were in their 70s, and he was to inherit everything.
Yeah.
And they almost left the farm. Like, they were running a really big, good operation, and he was ready to pack up. He was looking at different careers, retraining, going and working in the mines. And I remember sitting down with them and go, what the hell's happened? Like, they were a lovely family and they were relatively close, but the dad and the son had started, it just got niggly, and dad wouldn't let go and didn't want to make change. And it just took a process of 2 or 3 years of bringing them back to the table and having the conversations that hadn't been had in their 20s, that we finally got them to a point where they went, oh, okay, there's a path out of this. And now it's such a beautiful thing to see, 5 or 6 or whatever it is down the path, probably 5 years from when it all got sort of signed off on. they all get on like a house on fire. It's unbelievable. Mum and dad are as happy as a pig in mud. The kids are, the kids are now in their late 40s, but they're as happy as pigs in mud, and they've just massively grown the business, and their kids are just about going off to boarding school, ready to come back, and they're starting their own succession plan. It's like a great story, but one that on the surface you look at and go, one child back on the farm will inherit everything. How the hell could that fail?
Exactly.
And I remember going in and sitting down and just going, this makes no sense to me, but it was just some little niggling conversations that hadn't been had. Yeah. So my advice is have the conversations, do it respectfully though. Like remember that you have to act like a professional agribusiness owner. Don't go in hot-headed. And one of the greatest, one of my clients years ago said this to me, John, and it's really stuck with me. He said, Ben, he or she who loses their cool first loses the argument.
Yeah.
And my wife has reminded me of that many times over the years. And I think that's a really important one. You need to think like a business owner and try and keep that emotion out of it as much as you can. And like you said, have the conversations with the people involved, not in the back, not back at home bitching and moaning.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a hell of an important point because business, you've got two things intertwined here. We've touched on it last time, and it comes up without fail at every single business meeting I ever have, is you've got business and you've got family.
Yep. And
the skill that you need, if I can pass one thing on to you, the skill you need to start developing is have business as business, and you're going to have a ding-dong fight in the office about business stuff as business partners, and that should never go back to the bedroom or to the dining room table, either in the individual family spaces or in the joint family spaces. I don't know how many phone calls I get after Christmas and after Easter when for the first time in 12 months the families got together and you've only got 4 hours to get 14 years or 14 months worth of stuff off your chest, and it just blows. So coming back to that family you described, what's going on there is that no one's ever really understood the needs. So the successful families, they have a clear vision or preferred future, and they work really hard on that as a starting point. So the very first thing I'd be saying to these people is work on yourself. The business will take care of itself, but work on yourself and the people in the business.
What do you mean by that, John? Work on yourself?
Well, just understand what you want. So when you're at a 20, so I'll cut across both 20 and 30 and 40-year-olds.
Well, if you're 35 now, you still should be doing this. You're 20, you should be doing this.
And sometimes if you're 90, you should be doing this, because that's what unlocks the other end of it, is just understand what you need, not what you want, out of the relationship and the business you've gone into. So that family who only had a single son or daughter, he just wasn't happy, and the business obviously wasn't fulfilling his needs. He would have had all the money and all the wealth he ever could have wished for, I presume.
Yes.
But he still was not happy. And you remind me once, do you want to be happy or do you want to be right?
Yeah, well, my wife says that to me all the time, and I always say right.
Which is the wrong answer. And that's exactly it, because so working on yourself just looks like sitting down and understanding what you need, not so much what you want. What you need, what your desires are, what got you excited in the first place, what made you fall in love with the concept of farming or the idea of farming. Because if you can't find that, I'd suggest go and fall in love with something else, because it's going to be a drudgery. Go and be true to yourself, understand what you want out of it. If you're not getting that from your current position, be honest about it and stand up to yourself first before you stand up to anyone else and say, this business is not serving me. Because what we often do is we want the business to serve us. And sorry, the other way around. We often serve the business where the business should be serving us. So the business should be providing us with all the things that make us wake up in the morning, the finance that we get from it, and the passion. So if that's not coming from the business and you pouring that into the business, it's a one-way street. So work on yourself. It's called a vision. Companies and a lot of people have a vision or preferred future. Find out what that is. Nut that down for yourself. If you're married, nut that down with your partner or your husband or your wife. And they won't be the same. They'll be different things, but you need to then put those together, create what I call a joint vision or a joint preferred future. I'm not even talking about the business at this stage. Just for the people, your family. Work out what that looks like, and then see how does that fit into the business, rather than how does the business fit into my life. See how you fit into the business's life. And if those marry up, you'll have a fantastic business. You'll be easy to have conversations with people because you'll be very clear about what you want and need and desire. If you leave it up to someone else, as I said in the beginning, to work that out, you're probably going to get somebody else's imprint on what they think should be done for your life. So work on yourself. Have a clear vision. Have clear goals. Square up the past. If you've got to a point where you are now 30, 40 or 50, draw a line in the sand and square up the past. Call it what it is, have the meeting, and work out where you stand. It's never too late to change, but don't let it go on until you're 50 and 60.
What was it, John? Someone said to me once, they said, you got to let go of that shit, Ben, because it'll give you cancer.
Yeah.
And I think that's a metaphor for everything. It'll give the business a cancer. It'll give your life a cancer. It'll give your relationships a cancer. You got to let go of some stuff, don't you?
Yeah, and if you don't, you'll hang on to it. And as I said just now, that stuff just lives rent free in your head. It's like this voice that just consumes you, and everything you see about that person now in front of you, you start disliking, because everything you see will stack up to be a self-fulfilling type prophecy. So exactly that. You just got to draw the line, call it what it is, work to get consensus, absolutely work to, if this is what you want, work as hard as you can, get help, pick the phone up, give me a call, find someone who can step you through the process, agitate for change, work towards agreement, but don't sit on your hands, because that's going to cause that cancer you're talking about. It's just going to fester, and it doesn't go away by itself. Sticking your head in the sand is absolutely not an option. It's probably better to eject from the business than stick your head in the sand and think it'll all work out.
Because there is a percentage of people where they do need to walk away, where they're not going to get what they're looking for out of the business, and they need to make that call earlier on. And if they're driven and smart and got a good enough vision, they can make something out of themselves. I mean, I looked at our family business when I was growing up on the farm, and I loved farming, but I could see that my grandfather hadn't let go. My dad and my uncle were both on the farm. My uncle was working off farm as an accountant, and I just knew the pie would never, ever even come close to being split enough for me to come back, and I had to go make my own way in the world. And so for some people, that's the opportunity you maybe need to look at doing and be honest with yourself.
Yeah.
Is this going to, and don't stick your head in the sand. And mine was very obvious, but for others, it's not necessarily as obvious.
It's not, and the tragedy or the irony is that it's, from an external perspective, it's very often dead obvious. But when you're in the business and your head's down, bum up, working hard every day, you just don't see this freight train coming down the track. And that's where this is where so many families get a lot wrong. The one person, I believe, who can bring that perspective are the in-law siblings. So your son's wife or your daughter's husband or even their children can bring that perspective, because they have a vested interest, unlike your accountant or lawyer. They have a very close and vested interest in the business. And so often their perspective is discounted because they bear the brunt of a lot of the bedroom conversations and the dining room conversations. Son or daughter hasn't got the courage or the know-how or the wherewithal to have that conversation directly. But when you do eventually have some kind of a meeting, facilitated or not, please listen to your in-law children. They have a perspective that your family can't have, not doesn't have. It cannot have the same perspective as your in-law children, because they have a different paradigm they've grown up with. They can see stuff that your family takes as for granted or as normal. And it's really powerful to sit back and listen to those people rather than blame them for a lot of the drama that succession planning is proposed to create.
A couple of things for me, John, that I just thought of just to start to wrap this up, because we will give some things to do, is always act respectfully. I think the younger generation has to remember that they can demand respect as they're coming through, but you have to earn it.
Yeah.
So become something that someone can respect. And the second one, and I think show your parents respect. I think that's really important. They've got the business to where it is. Previous generations have worked and sacrificed a lot. And the next one for me, John, is prepare yourself. Like you said, work on yourself. But I think if you were in a corporate business, so let's say it wasn't an agribusiness, it was a corporate business, and it was a big family business worth millions of dollars, they'd put you through an apprenticeship. Like, they wouldn't let the next generation take over unless they were generally capable. So you need to be thinking about, okay, well, if I've got to run this business and grow it, like you mentioned, you want to be trying to grow this business, you've got to be the right person. So start thinking like a business owner and saying, okay, well, what's my plan? What's my pitch? And potentially go to mum and dad and say, hey, you know what, you've done really well to get where you have based on, grandparents' work, etc. I've got a vision for the future of this business and I want to drive it and I want to get you what you want. And I think find out what your parents want. For me, like the amount of times that have come in, they go, I want to take over the farm. I want to take over the succession plan. Why isn't this happening? And I'd say, well, what do your parents need? Like, what do they actually need to get the hell out of Dodge, so to speak?
Yes.
And they'd look at me with this blank look and I don't know. It's like, well, if you don't know what your parents need, you can't give them what they need.
Yep.
And then once you find out what mum and dad need to be able to transition or custodially hand over the farm, then you can actually put a plan together to get them that. Because what I've found is, soon as the parents get what they need, they're usually so comfortable to let go.
Yeah.
And so it's incumbent on you, the next generation, if you want to get ahead, to find out what they need. And that could be as simple as a plan for their future.
Correct.
And then you can all work towards that over a 5-10 year period or 2-year period to get them where they want to be. And that's enough from me. This is dragging your brain out.
No,
what else can they do, John?
It's exactly that, Ben. It's that simple. If it comes back to that word assumptions. If we assume that we think, or if we assume anything about the other side of the coin, the younger generation is assuming their parents want something, and the older generation is assuming the opposite, you got no chance. So how do you get those two opposing thought patterns working? You've got to talk. You can't do this by telepathy. You can't do this process by guessing who wants what when. You've got to sit down and open your mouth and describe to the other party what you need. Because I always say to them, unless you know what each other needs, you can't help be part of the solution. Because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a solution here, not separate parts. So we've got one business, multiple people, and they all have desires, needs, and wants. And if you don't know what my needs are, well, there's no chance that you can help me fulfill those. So again, you're going to be guessing, and this is where it comes back to the very first point, is visions and goals, and more so vision. Understand yourself. What do you want out of it? How far are you prepared to go until you have to pull the pin? And probably the last thing that a lot of people do is they threaten. So both sides of the generational
That's
conversation.
an important point, John. Yeah.
There's a lot of threatening goes on. If you do this, then that, and but I can't, or whatever. So again, if you and your wife or your family has a very clear vision and you are prepared to go to a certain point, and you need to be able to stand behind that, and that's a very difficult place to get to in the first instance, because you and your family have to have absolute resolve that if we can't get change, or if we can't get to where this needs to be by a certain time, a year's time or 6 months or tomorrow, we are then going to act out what we have said. If you don't act that out, it becomes a veiled threat, and then it becomes a broken promise. And if you don't act out what you say you're going to do, well, then your parents or vice versa will just say, well, that's not going to work. They keep saying they're going to leave. They keep saying they're going to do something. They keep saying it's not working, but they're not doing anything. So we'll just default back to status quo. And, it's a nasty thing to say, but that's what happens, is they basically play each other off because the alternative seems so uncomfortable and so difficult to attain, which is a simple civil conversation. I see that over and over again, where threats are made, they're not enacted, or decisions are made, they're not enacted, which then becomes a threat, and then the whole thing unravels, and the respect and trust just dissolves.
Oh, look, and I have that with my 6-year-old, where I learned very early on, when I threaten things, I have to follow through.
Yeah.
And my wife is far better at that. She's very good. So when I say, look, you've got to do this, she looks at me, because I'm a little bit more of a soft touch. Yeah. And she looks at me and says, oh, yeah, Dad, whatever.
You're really going to follow through?
Yeah, whereas Mum says, if this doesn't happen, this is what's going to happen. She's like quick smart. Like it just happens. And Mum does it very doesn't do it with threats. She just says, this is the rules, this is what's going to happen, and she just follows through with it every time, and consistency, and it just and so my 6-year-old pretty much follows everything Mum says.
Yeah, it's that follow through, Ben. It's exactly that, and it's probably the best analogy is that kid one, because most of us have been there or going there. Is you have to follow through on the action plan you've taken. You can only follow through if you have consensus, and once you have that consensus, it's not that difficult to follow through, because what you realise is if you don't, you're corrupting your own values.
Absolutely, yeah. So, John, to round this out, because we're just running out of time. So, is there anything you'd like to add before we say what a couple of things listeners can do to get some forward momentum? Because I think this is the biggest issue: is most people are wanting to get forward momentum. Is there anything else you'd like to add in there, John, before we go on to that?
Ben, I think we'll touch on it in the older generation again. It's if you have exhausted what you believe to be the conversational route, is get a pen out and get a piece of paper and write a letter, or at least get your thoughts out of your head and onto paper. It's a fundamental first starting point. So if any of you listening do some work with me, I'm going to get a piece of paper in front of you, I'm going to get a pen in your hand, and I'm going to ask you to write some stuff down about you, about the business, and about the people of the business. So I'd suggest if you have exhausted verbally trying to communicate with the family, whether it be even just your partner, your wife, your husband, get a pen out and get that stuff onto paper. That's the first point. The second one is pick up the phone and call somebody. And call someone who's a facilitator of people, not a facilitator of the business. We can get there are many business operators, what would you call them, mentors or business coaches out there. I would suggest the first person you want is a people mentor, facilitator. Deal with the family issues first, and then we work out the business issues.
Okay, that's great advice. So let's round off, John, with I've written down here, what are 2 things people in this age group, the young'uns, can do to get some forward momentum on this?
When you come back to the farm, at whatever age you are, whether you're 20 or 40, make sure you come back with a written contract of employment. Have expectations of each other, of yourself, and of the business, and get that formalized. If you can't get that fundamental piece of the puzzle sorted out at an early phase, you're probably going to be phoning someone down the track to unravel a lot of problems. So if you're working for an accounting firm, you would have a whole heap of KPIs and expectations, and what days on and days off, and what are you expected to do, and what are the protocols if you misbehave? How do you employ and dismiss people? So just get a written basic of that in place with your employer, who could be your father, your mother, or your business at that point in time. That's the first thing I do, is no matter what age you are, get something down on paper that makes sense to all of you. You can change it over time, but get that down so it opens the door to further conversations. And the second one, and for the younger generations, whether you're 18 or 38, is start building your own wealth. Start building your own balance sheet. Make sure the salary you're getting paid and the promises you're getting made align with your needs. And make sure you can get savings out of that, so that down the track, when things go pear-shaped, that just means you might have children who have bigger needs than what your business can supply. You have a war chest of wealth or money or finances to make change happen. If you don't, you're stuck. So look after yourself first. It might sound selfish, but the business is not going to look after you unless you look after the business. So make sure you look after yourself first. Get all those structures in place, and be proactive. Get in front of it. Don't be bullied by people to just come and work for a promise and a prayer. Get things on paper, clear the air, have the conversations, and treat business as business, and create a loving family while you do that.
I think that's 2 really good points. I just wrote one down earlier too, John, is I think I just go back to reinforce that. Find out what the hell mum and dad want.
Yeah.
So open the conversation and dig until you. It might take a couple of years to get the answer. It might take a couple of days, but dig and digs. And the question I would ask my mum and dad if I was back on the farm would be, mum and dad, what would have to be true for you to feel comfortable to hand on the farm?
Yeah.
Okay, so what would have to be true? And then whatever you do, just find that out, because that's your key to success. Because if they might say, well, look, I want to know, they might say something like, well, we want to know that you've got the skills to be able to manage the $1 million in debt or the $50 million in debt, whatever it might be, or we want to know that we're financially secure in retirement, or we've got enough off-farm assets to retire. Whatever that is, find out what that is, and then you can work back from there and say, okay, well, your whole focus should be on getting mum and dad what they need, and so that you can actually take over. Then it becomes a lot easier. Now, also too, that allows you to figure out if what they want is unreasonable and unattainable, or not the path you want to go on. Well, then that's an answer for you up front to make some choices. You can then pivot.
Early warning. Yeah,
absolutely. So awesome job. Well, look, that's fantastic. As I said, everyone listening, if you're the younger generation, hope you enjoyed it. Get mum and dad to have a listen, because I think it's really important that they understand where you're coming from. And if you know anyone out there, make sure you share the wealth and wisdom. John's investing a good amount of his time and knowledge here, trying to make a difference. So yeah, we'll head off now, and the next episode we'll be talking to the oldies, or mum and dad.
Correct, Ben. And for you young guys out there and girls, link this back to that episode 24 that we recorded a few months ago. It gives the basis of how you go about starting some of these conversations and what they should look like and who should be there and when they should be had. So go back, I think it's episode 24. Have a listen to that. One other tip is a lot of the people who phone me have put that conversation, that podcast, in front of the people that they're battling to have this conversation with. So instead of writing them that letter, John and Ben have forwarded that podcast to their parents or their sisters, some in London, some in Germany, to be honest, and Tasmania with WA. So it's just an icebreaker to start the conversation, and really it's a powerful tool.
It is, and that's probably a really valuable point. One of the things, just to round this off, John, you said to me was, it was amazing the number of people that contacted you that actually someone had forward them the podcast to listen to, and they didn't listen to podcasts. So they weren't a sort of person that naturally sought out podcasts. They were people that had never really had anything to do with podcasts. Someone sent along to them. They listened to it and went, wow, this is us.
Correct.
And so, yeah, that's what's really important, to share this as much as you can, especially with your family and maybe even the off-farm siblings, so they understand what's going on as well. So
that's fair. I think without exception, every single person who's phoned me has said, it felt like you were talking to me or us. And they said, well, how do we start this conversation? Because we converted. That's why I'm phoning you. We know this. We know this needs to happen, but mum and dad or my brothers don't. And 50% of them have phoned me back later and said, we sent that across to them, and it makes sense. They understand now where we're coming from, and we haven't had to tell them. They've heard it from you, or they've heard it from someone who cares, that there is a way through this thing. So it diffuses or deflects the spotlight or the attention where someone's agitating, trying to get a conversation started, but it's damn hard to go to dad and grab him by the scruff of the neck and say, I'm not doing anything further until we have this conversation. They have a tool now, I believe, which has been an unintended consequence of what we've started here, is to put these tools in front of those people that they're battling to start the conversation with. And hopefully that's really what these podcasts become, is just a tool to start the process for these families.
Excellent. Righto, we'll sign off now, and we'll be back with the next episode, as I said, with the oldies. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Ben.